دكتور باول أن يقدم محاضرته.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me to speak again. It's a pleasure to be here. And again, I learned a few Arabic words last night, but I did not learn enough of them to give my talk, so I'm going to again speak in English today. What I'd like to talk about this morning, I was introduced and it's mentioned that I've had the opportunity to serve in large U.S. companies, some small startup Silicon Valley companies where I'm from, and also in some professional societies. And the talk that I'm going to give to you now is based mostly on the work that I did as a technology officer in large U.S. companies managing large R&D organizations, and looking predominantly now, I'd like to try and couple the role of innovation, the role of intellectual property and intellectual capital with that of economic development. And it's really through the work of research and technology and working with others that have also had the opportunity to work in R&D organizations to study how does R&D generate wealth for companies and for countries. And I'd like to share that with you, some observations this morning. Now, the first thing that I want to do is that you notice for the structure of this presentation, I've put up the word hypothesis, and I mean that in the scientific sense. What I shared with you yesterday, I felt fairly certain of, and it was pretty much based on facts and very solid observations. What I'm going to share with you this morning is less certain, but I hope that it will provide us a good background to think about how economic development might be best accomplished in different areas of the world. So my hypothesis, and I'm going to try and support it, will be that countries should direct the government and university innovation. Those resources should be done in accordance with their human capital and intellectual property capabilities. And that there's some sweet spots in terms of the innovation type and the industry segment that tend to make a country's economic development easier. And I'll try then to support those two statements with showing you kinds of innovation, where does breakthrough research occur, why it occurs there, and the implications for nations that have a commodity-rich environment. So that will be what we try and accomplish this morning. Let me start by a bit of background, making sure that I share something of what I mean by breakthrough innovation and contrast that to incremental innovation and next-generation innovation. On the chart, what I'm looking at is the market life cycle. Remember yesterday I shared with you the idea of the Schumpeter technology curves. And there were those that would sit there, they would start, they would emerge, they would grow, they would mature, and then they would decline. And then another one would come along with emerging, growing, maturing, declining. That's what's on the vertical axis here, those long waves, or in some technologies, embedded within those long waves are much shorter. They can be as short as a year or two. On the horizontal axis, what I'm showing is what is the product like that's being produced? Is it new to the world? The world has never seen anything like this before. I mean, the world never saw Google before it existed. It hadn't seen Facebook. It hadn't seen the automobile a century ago. It hadn't seen farming equipment a century before that. So was it new to the world, or was it something that was an improvement, something that the world had already experienced? We already knew what cars were, but now we put rear view mirrors in them, we put LEDs in the headlights. They're improvements, but the world already knows the basic functionality of the innovation. When you graph it this way, what we see in the upper right is what's breakthrough innovation. It's early in the trend. It's not yet technically well understood. And in terms of the market has never seen it. And when you end up with technologies and products and services in this square, I'm from Silicon Valley, we call that suicide square, where you basically take your own life. It is very, very, very difficult to bring out and start a successful company in that area. And that's what's so incredible about some of the accomplishments of organizations like Google. At the other end of the extreme is incremental innovation, which are slight changes in the technology, and the market is very mature, almost in decline. Now, what I want to point out is there's a sweet spot sitting in the middle there where you can get predictable R&D returns in a general sense, and the risk is much lower than the upper right. The world needs all types of innovation along this matrix, but there are, and what I find is that as I look at the press, I find people in the political area and people that are really trying to make a difference in society. Everybody talks about doing breakthrough innovation and investing in that. The truth of the matter is it's very difficult to do, and there's very few places where you can do breakthrough innovation. I'd like to illustrate that on this slide. If we take 3 technologies, and these maps were drawn in about 2009, so they've changed a lot since the time they were put together. But at that time, if you looked at the research that was done in fuel cells, stem cell research, and nanotechnology, what you see is the level of investment. Dark red on these maps are heavy levels of investment. And I know they're heavy levels of investment because it takes, we've done benchmarking throughout the world, it takes about $1 million of investment in hard work to create a patent. It's not a perfect metric, it varies from industry to industry, but when you look at very strong investment patterns, you can look at intellectual property as a way to decide where things are being done. And what you see is fuel cell is mostly US, Europe, China, Japan, Korea. Stem cell, pretty much the same area. Nanotechnology, you see yourselves in Saudi Arabia, mostly through some of the work here that had a presence in nanotechnology. So economic development is really, if you look at this, it's focused in areas, as you look at those world maps, where there's infrastructure and financial resources to compete on a global basis. Now, what do I mean by strength of human resources and financial resources? And here I'd like to go back to the first talk that we had this morning. When I look at what the relationship is between innovation and economic development, and I'll come to intellectual property, but let's just do innovation and economic development. One of the things that I've looked at through a period of time is I look at the health and the wealth of a nation. And remember yesterday I gave you that Maslow triangle. You can't have economic development, you can't make great progress if you can't eat. If you are in a country that doesn't have enough food, it's hard to be worrying about inventing things to build beautiful buildings. I mean, it's about staying healthy, it's about survival. So if your life expectancy is low, and if you look at the amount of money that's available in a country, I'm using gross domestic product, GDP, as a way to measure that. If you're at the lower right of this matrix, these countries have a very difficult time. If you live there, it's about survival. It's only till you get to the upper right that you have enough resources, that people are living long enough because they're healthy, that you can afford to invest in universities and you can afford to think about advancing science and technology. I want to point out, too, that the bottom axis on this, the vertical axis by life, is linear. It's a arithmetic scale. The x-axis, if you look at it carefully, is logarithmic. So this x-axis, even though I show this map as a square, this is a really long thing. There's a big difference between being on the right of this and or excuse me, to the left of it and on the right of it. Now, why is this important? Because if you look at, yesterday I introduced the long wave cycle. If you look at how countries have evolved, in this case I happen to show the United States and Germany as two examples. What you can see in the US example is you can see some of those Schumpeter long-term waves. You don't go straight from one to the other. What you see is that technology develops as people developed new ways to improve agriculture so that people had the time to learn how to build factories. And then they learned about steel and they started to build things like automobiles that required higher performance materials. And then you see more recently the innovation in the knowledge-based economy in the upper right. And what you see is you can actually see those Schumpeter cycles of you make an advancement in technology and you improve not only the wealth, the economic wealth, but important, I think, for all of us to realize is that you also improve the health. You improve the quality of life and the longevity and the kind of life that people in our countries enjoy. So you move from one to the other. I put up Germany as another example because they've ended up now very much at the top. But you notice their pathway wasn't very stable. It goes up, goes around a little bit, goes up. What is that? That's the result of leadership in the country deciding to engage in things of conflict and of not working together. And what you see here is you can actually see the effects of the different wars that Germany has been in, and you can see the effects actually of the United States as it goes through some of its wars. So one of the things that's important for this is the economic development is really tied, in my mind, to technology development, and it improves both health and wealth at the same time. Now, in the upper right-hand quadrant, there are countries, there are Arab states up there, there's other entities that are in that area. And so what I want to focus on, those countries that have the health and the wealth to really be developed, what other things might be required? Here I'm going to go to some work by Hernando de Soto. And the first thing he said is, if you really want to have a developing entity, a country or a region, first off, political stability and a rule of law. If we look at the example for Germany, when you see it's unstable politically, you have problems. There were something like 80 different countries on that map. If you go back and draw those little pictures for all of them, the ones that have been in wars, you can just see what happens to them. The second thing is to remove the bureaucratic and regulatory barriers to the formation and operation of new businesses. There's some regions in the world where it's not easy to put together a new business. But where it is, you really get an increase in technology and in economic development. And what we heard in our second speakers from China, where they have a part of their country where they're working very hard to make the regulations business-friendly and to try and experiment with new ways of putting companies together, you really can get good economic growth. And the most important factor, I think, for the conference that we have here today is the third factor. You really need to have intellectual property protection in place so that it will attract angel and venture capital. It really, remember, I have a hypothesis. My hypothesis is that it is private capital. Government may contribute a little bit, but it's private capital, angel and venture capital firms that really feed economic growth. If you rely too much on the government, you end up with factor number 2. It becomes bureaucratic, it becomes slow, and it's not competitive. So what we saw in the case of the area with China, they were able to attract, if you looked at it, 400 firms that they had. It was 420,000 small and medium-sized businesses. 30,000 with respect to brand new innovative technologies. When you have intellectual property protection and you have angel and venture funding, you can really feed a network of local entrepreneurs. And these are people that understand the connection between technology, intellectual property, and a successful business in a successful region. Now, I'd like to think a little bit about, I told you that Suicide Square, some of those new areas are hard to get into. I've put a map up here that's going to be very difficult for you to see. And part of it is by design, part of it because I didn't have room on the paper, to be honest. What it shows, though, and this is research that was done on almost 1,000 companies, mostly in the US and Europe. And what people were looking for is how come some companies' R&D efforts are much stronger than others? What makes them successful? And one of the things that was found is that you can't have a single kind of R&D organization that works well in pharmaceuticals that is not going to work well for Microsoft, and it's certainly not going to work well for a large consumer products company like Procter & Gamble. So what is it that makes each of them different? It was found that if you think about the kind of research that's been done, is it science, is it engineering, or is it industrial design? And if you look also, is the product that's produced one that the government regulates, that industry standards dominate, or that the consumer needs dominate, you can build a matrix. And when you build a matrix like this and look at R&D and the role that technology plays in creating company wealth, you can start to see that in the upper left-hand quadrant, you're going to create an organization that almost looks like a university, and you want very smart individuals. If you go down to the complete extreme on the lower right, you want a design-based organization. You do not need Nobel laureates. You do not need PhDs. You need people that have really good insight as to what the market wants, and it's incremental, fast innovation. Important for us today is to know that intellectual property is used differently in each of these areas. Again, in the upper left. What's important if you're doing basic scientific university research is that you have a breakthrough. You understand what Mother Nature, what nature lets you do. Science understands that. And after you do that, you need very rapid engineering development around that core patent. So what we see is what we call a patent fence. And what we see around the basic core science invention is a lot of engineering inventiveness. And then you see a third generation, a multiple generation patent fence, where what you see is all of the applications that actually reach the hands of consumers. And companies and organizations that can put together the breakthrough and rapid engineering and rapid design, those are the ones that make money in the field. If you make the breakthrough innovation, but you're slow and other people beat you to the engineering, then you're really good at bringing out new technology. But in fact, what you are is you end up being the R&D center for the rest of the industry. This was really brought to the attention of people in the US when studies were done on US organizations. And what people found was that Eastman Chemical Corporation, a large chemical company, was basically the R&D center for the rest of the industry. Eastman Chemical would come up with a breakthrough, like a university, and then Shell and Dow would build the engineering and the product fences around them. Eastman Chemical just about went bankrupt, and Dow and Shell had really done a nice job of expanding their businesses. So you use intellectual property one way in that quadrant. In the center of the matrix, it's about mass. And we heard the conversation about Japan and how Japan had picked a strategy of intellectual property that really aided their industry. And what did we hear? Narrow focus claims, lots of incremental innovation, big patent portfolios, and that way they were able to really take over a particular industry segment. In the center there is the computers, the internet, all the consumer electronics that we have. And what you find out is that's exactly what's required for success there. It's not about a breakthrough, multiple generation patent fences. It's just how much incremental art can you create and how fast can you create it and how big is your portfolio. So Japan picked a strategy that played exactly to the kinds of businesses that they were investing in. As you move to the bottom part of the quadrant, what you find is you need almost no patents. It's all about trademarks that really protects those businesses. So with this kind of a model, what we can quickly do then is look at the top end of the thing, what I call the suicide square. Why can only certain countries invest in this? If you look at I just looked at the last couple of weeks, months activity in the US and in Europe. Looking at those databases, what you find out is there were 21,000 documents issued since the 1st of April in the United States. Europe, the European Patent Office published 9,000. If you look at what they were, there was a segment that was focused on medical, a big segment everybody's investing in what's called big data. It's the interconnection of large databases. And when we think about the map, what we're looking at are two specific examples of what I was showing in the upper left. This is larger print. And what I want to bring your attention to is that to be successful in making money and economic development in these fields, it's what's shown in the yellow section partway down the graph. And what you see is that to be in that medical area, you have to be the only person with the portfolio. In other words, you have to really lock people out. So you need these multiple generation patent fences, and you have to have very fast cycle times. Otherwise, people will get in. So you need a very aggressive, highly integrated system. If you're doing research in a university, you have to immediately take it out, immediately put it into a startup company, have them build out the portfolio, and get the acquisition into a large pharma company quickly so that the patent fence can continue to be built out with products. Likewise, for big data, that was one in the center. It's what we heard described in Japan. A lot of incremental innovation, a lot of just quick variations on a theme. And there, what it counts is just speed and basic numbers. So when you think about that, and you think about the ability of a commodity-based nation to compete with 21,000 patents in the last 2 months. You look at the largest IP holder in that list. The largest person had 1%. That would be something on the order of 200 patents. That means the large companies are putting out 200 patents a month. And so if you think about if you want to play that game, that's the kind of velocity you need. I think that's very difficult for a commodity-based nation unless you have the infrastructure like we saw in China, where you have all these small startups, where you've got lots of activity, lots of entrepreneurs. It's really hard to reach those velocities. And so there at the bottom of this slide, you see what I say. I really think that if you're running in a commodity-based environment, what you want to do is focus on areas that play to your strength. Just as Japan picked an area that in the 1950s was at the end of not requiring as much intellectual property as we see today, you want to pick areas that are sweet spots. And what do I mean by that? If we go back to this matrix, what you find is in the upper left, those are the ones that are very difficult to penetrate. But there's a whole section coming down the middle to the right that are industries for which technology and intellectual property, the speed, the pace, the kind of way communities have to work together to be successful really plays to the kinds of environments that we find typically in commodity-based industries. Here are three of them. One is a particular model. It's based on petrochemicals, basically the kind of work that you think of Saudi Aramco drilling for oil. And in these environments, if you look at what's important there, it's that you have an average size portfolio. And an average size portfolio in these industries is 50 to 500 patents. We're not talking about having 10 to 20,000 to 100,000 like it takes in electronics. We're talking about 50 to 1,000. It's achievable for an organization in a country to enter there. Also, if you look at the pace, it's much slower, it's methodical. You can sit there and take things from a university and bring them to an organization and build out a portfolio in a reasonable period of time, years instead of months. As you look at the chemical products industry, polymers, areas that you're thinking of going in your own country, there again, it's a different pace. It requires a different kind of intellectual property portfolio. This case is a bit more sophisticated. Now you need at least a first-generation patent fence. It's not about just the patents. You need to also think about building out and capturing a little bit more art. And then if you look to the future and look at the specialty ingredients for food, chemicals, some of the work that will go into solar cells, the makeup of those, there you're going to need a little bit faster, a little bit larger, and you're going to have to start making sure those patent fences are much more solid.
2 minutes, please.
Yeah. So with that, I hope that what I've been able to do is show you what kinds of innovation there are, which elements make up breakthrough innovation, why is it occurring there, and the implications that I think it brings up for commodity-based businesses. I hope my talk has complemented the first two that you've seen, and that I'm based on that. The proposed strategy that I gave you, if I've done a good job, you might see your way to support the hypothesis that you really should be generating R&D and economic development by directed government and university innovation. You need to do it in a way that pulls that quickly through to startups and your companies, and that you should focus on the industries that where the intellectual property and the technology evolution is of a kind and a type and a place that plays to your strengths. Thank you very much.
الآن محاضرتنا الرابعة. شكرا دكتور باول على هذا العرض الجميل. الآن محاضرتنا الرابعة في هذه الجلسة بعنوان دور وسطاء الملكية الفكرية تطبيق الابتكار المفتوح في المؤسسات. يلقيها الدكتور زي. الدكتور زي حاصل على درجة الدكتوراه والبكالوريوس في هندسة النظم والتحكم الآلي، وهو يعمل حاليا كمدير شركة الIBI والتي تأسست حديثا ضمن خطة سنغافوريا إلى 2015، وهي تعمل في لتكون مصدر للتقنيات ذات العلاقة مع الشركات الأخرى. الحقيقة السي في مليانة في الإنجازات، ولكن ما عندنا وقت نقرأها كاملة، فنطلب من الدكتور أن يقدم عرضه والشكر.
Thank you. A very good morning to all of you. I'm very happy to be invited to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. This is my first visit to your country, and thank you for the warm hospitalities, and also to meet friends from the Arab countries. And I really want to thank CATS, GCC, as well as Renat, LES, Arab countries for inviting me to speak at your second Saudi IP Forum. On IP,